I've been reading some work from a group of sociologists who are doing some stuff at the minute around kind of relational sociology. Now, as a psychologist, I shouldn't really admit that, but like it really speaks to me as I'm a social psychologist by trade, particularly interested in social identity and the groups we belong to. But fundamentally, what they're talking about, and some of them are from Strathclyde, so I'm hoping that they're around today. It'd be nice to speak to them. We have to get away from the idea that the person at the end is a rational actor, that they are making a decision based on perfect information that is based on them being engaged in the process, and that is based on them constantly looking and seeking out the best solution for them, because I don't think that's the reality for the most part. And I think there's a really interesting kind of reset probably around how we do research around this. And I think we've got to get into the communities more. I think we've got to do an awful lot more talking to the end user and talking to the person. And I think then it's a case of working backwards. So the part of the reason we did the value stream mapping was that we could plot this point here is problematic for people in terms of how you communicate this bit of information to this person. And I think what we'll probably end up with in the analysis is a very messy first lash at being able to plot where those points are. I think there's also another thing we're working on at the minute is a tool, like a kind of screening tool almost, for where someone's likely to be struggling with technology acceptance. And you can underpin that with a variety of different psychological, theoretical concepts. But if you look at things like someone's perceived capabilities, their opportunity for engaging with it, their motivations for engaging with it, that's a pretty good set of predictors for their likely behavior. Not perfect, but pretty good. And I think it's about then trying to make versions of that tool, which would be you could adapt for different sets of people based on the kind of context in which they find themselves. I think that would be an important part of it. And then it's about putting tools like that into the hands of social housing, for example, and saying, well, if you know that you're going to go street by street in the next 3 or 4 years and you're going to be doing big retrofit and installations of new technologies, get ahead of it. You know, get and talk to those communities. You can use a tool that might be like that to understand what are the big drivers of people's kind of maybe disengagement or potential disengagement, and get ahead of it and find ways to kind of communicate in slightly different ways. I think one of the things that's really interesting as well is that I hear a lot in the sector that it's a problem of education, and people just need to understand better that this is really good. For some people that's true, but like I also know I shouldn't have the second Mars bar, but I do, and I know I shouldn't go to the pub and have the 4 or 5 pints that I do have, but I do have them. And we know that behavior change isn't simple. It's not about understanding a reality and then acting directly in relation to that. It's much more complicated. It's much more about what your friends and family think. It's much more about what your local community thinks, and just anecdotally, often you see solar panels in batches, don't you? When you're driving down the streets, because the neighbours got them. And they say, this is great. This is really good. And I think there's something around kind of just turning that around and thinking much more about who are these end users, what are their realities, and what are the things that are actually influential in terms of them being engaged in this process. And I think that's something that we're really keen to work on. So I'm presenting some work we've done over the last 6-12 months around technology acceptance amongst social housing tenants in Wales. In the University of South Wales, we've established a health and housing research network over the last couple of years, almost by accident, by making some friends and people kind of saying that there was a world that they wanted some help with that maybe psychology could play a role in. We worked through some consensus work with the sector to say, well, what are the priorities? What would you think we should be focusing on? And we kind of forced people through the mangle over the course of a day, and we ended up with 5. And one of those was technology and AI and the opportunities, barriers, facilitators for doing things in that. In Wales in particular, there's the optimised retrofit programme, which is being pushed pretty heavily by the Welsh Government. Social housing, they're needing to work through that kind of at speed, and there's an awful lot of work going on around retrofitting homes, and that includes embedding technologies in a variety of ways. So that goes from things like air quality monitors through to more kind of hands-on technologies like air source heat pumps. And what we were hearing from the people who kind of more community minded, I suppose, was that actually that's quite challenging at the front end, and that tenants weren't necessarily always super keen on having that stuff in their house. And as a psychologist, I was kind of really interested in what's the process by which someone receives that technology. So where does it come from? How do they learn about it? What's the process? And my sense is that some people really are super interested and most people aren't. And that means it's probably fairly low priority for a lot of people, and it's seen as a bit of an inconvenience to have someone come in and install something in your house and work through it. Psychologically, I think there's a kind of series of interesting things there that you can unpick. So we went to Welsh Government with an idea for a project, which had two key work packages. One was a systematic review of the literature looking specifically at technology acceptance for smart devices in social housing. And what we found from that was that there isn't a huge amount of evidence looking at technology acceptance for that. That's kind of interesting. And also the studies that were there were often quite low quality. So they were missing baseline data, or it was kind of, their risk of bias was quite high. Not in I don't mean that in they were biased studies. I just mean their risk of bias because of a series of quality measures meant that they were potentially high in that. And so there's not necessarily a huge weight of evidence looking at how people are responding to that in practice. Social housing in particular is really interesting to me because these are predominantly people who've got from lower socioeconomic statuses. They've got less choice in their everyday life because they've got less means by which to have more choice. And what's happening in social housing is that technology is often being imposed as opposed to them being the driver of it. And psychologically, that's an interesting combination of factors. When you look at something like technology acceptance, you would kind of expect that somebody would be more inclined to pick up a new piece of technology where they had decided. And actually, a lot of the evidence that is out there skews towards early adopter, green identity, people who've done it for themselves because they're enthusiastic and engaged with it, net zero, kind of, idealistic view of the world. And that's not necessarily reflective of the people who are in social housing. So the systematic review is instructive in the sense that they're a probably under-researched group when it comes to this. And that sits in kind of alignment with the fact then, though, that they are, because they're in social housing, they're one of the areas that's easiest to grab hold of from a policy perspective. Certainly that's what's kind of happening in Wales at the minute, is that housing associations are kind of engaging with Welsh Government because there's a lot of funding there and they're easier to kind of to engage with in that sense. The second part of the project that we kind of got some funding from Welsh Government for was looking really at the process from top to bottom of a person in social housing receiving some new technology, whatever that might be. And what we were interested in there was the process by which that happens across different groups of people. So you go from policy level through to people who are designing and manufacturing, through to people who are procuring within a social housing environment, through to people who are then installing, monitoring the data, doing something with it, through to the tenant engagement teams, the neighbourhood officers, and then through to the tenants. And actually what you've got there are 5 or 6 quite difficult steps to navigate. And what I suspect is happening, we're working through the data at the minute, but what I suspect is that it's a really hard process. And what's ending up with a tenant isn't necessarily this slick, really well thought out, considered thing that's at the top of the process, because it's had to go through all of these different stages where one person is passing that information to the next, who's passing it to the next. And in every one of those scenarios, everyone's got their own set of principles, things they need out of that conversation, because I'm trying to sell you this product, or because I'm trying to pick the most cost efficient one for my particular housing association, or I'm then trying to explain it to someone who's working in the community, and then they're trying to explain it to the tenants. And so we engaged in a process called value stream mapping, which we've adapted from primarily the version we looked at was from a healthcare perspective. I think there's a paper looking at setting up a new oncology service. And largely what that does is it asks multiple stakeholders from different groups to plot from the start to the end what their role is, how they transfer to the next person, what the wider environment is that they have to kind of try and do that in, and then you get at the end of that an entire process. What you would hope would be that would be something that everyone at every point could explain. They couldn't really. It was very, very difficult to do that. We had 5 different tables. On each of them were different stakeholders. So we had people from Welsh Government, we had people from housing associations from all of those different roles, so procurement, through to tenant engagement, through to installation, through to monitoring. And we also had people from health boards. There was a kind of real mix of people there. And it was very, very complicated. It was really, really hard. And I think there's no wonder, therefore, that when you're at the end of the process, you get people who are not that interested, and it's not top of their priority list, and they're sometimes it's not that keen on having it in the first place.